Mr. Gibson thought every morning that he would give up this job. After all, he's already 64 years old. It's time to rest. And yet, day after day, he went through the forest like a madman, working as a gamekeeper. They couldn't find a replacement for him yet. Mr. Gibson's whole life had passed in the forest. When he came back from the army, they convinced him to work in the district forest as a gamekeeper. He loved his job and couldn't imagine himself without it. It was in the forest that he met Mary, his future wife. It was quite funny. They lived in the same village but had never seen each other. Mary had just come from the city to her grandmother's for the summer. She went to the forest for berries and got lost. She was sitting on a stump, crying, and then Mr. Gibson came out of the spruce grove. He saw the girl sitting there, approached her, calmed her down, and they got to know each other. Then they returned to the village together, and Mary never went back to the city. She married Mr. Gibson. Her parents were shocked. She left the capital suitors for a simple gamekeeper. But Mary and Mr. Gibson were happy, and they lived soul to soul throughout their lives. They raised a daughter who now lives in the city. Recently, Teresa got married and got a job at a prestigious trading company. And everything would be fine, but then tragedy struck. Mary died. The doctors discovered a tumor too late, and nothing could be done. It was hard for Mr. Gibson in the first few months after his wife's funeral. His wife invited him to live with her, but he didn't go. Where could he go from his village and his wife's grave? Everything here was familiar and dear, and the forest. It was the forest that brought him back to life, calmed his thoughts and his heart, and even eased his longing for Mary. No, Mr. Gibson was not going to quit his job. The forest was his life. That morning, Mr. Gibson, as usual, left the house. The sun peeked out from behind the forest. The sky was clear and clean. The warm wind hugged him. Birds chirped in the bushes. It was going to be a good day. Mr. Gibson decided to visit the distant clearing. 2 days ago, Henry, a local boy, saw strangers there. He went there for berries and said that a black foreign car was parked by the forest. Maybe someone just came to the forest, or maybe they had bad intentions. It was worth checking. The old man started his old motorcycle and headed out on the dirt road, riding and enjoying nature. There's no better place on earth. He thought the city was nothing compared to this place. He'd been there a few times and didn't like it. Like it. Noise, hustle and bustle, heavy air. His place was much better. Spacious and easy to breathe. When Mr. Gibson reached the distant clearing, he silenced the motorcycle and rolled it up to the nearest pine tree, saying, "Stand here, buddy. No one will touch you here." And indeed, everyone in the neighborhood knew the old gamekeeper's motorcycle. If they saw it near the forest, they became more disciplined. They did not make noise, break branches, or throw garbage. The old gamekeeper walked through the forest and everything seemed to be in order. Apparently, Henry was making trouble for nothing. Mr. Gibson was about to turn back when he suddenly heard moaning or crying coming from a dry snag in the forest. He listened and realized someone seemed to be whining. Taking his old shotgun, he cautiously moved towards the clearing. He approached and was stunned. A lynx was sitting 10 steps away from him, a large, young, beautiful specimen. Only the tufts on her ears drooped, and there was silent pain in her eyes. The old man glanced down and groaned in frustration. Both of the lynx's front paws were tightly clamped in a huge trap. That's what the newcomers did here yesterday, he thought. They set traps for bears. What a rascal! The old man cursed and took a step towards the lynx. The iron jaws tightly gripped the paws and were deeply embedded in the animal's flesh. It looked like even the bone was broken. Mr. Gibson didn't know what to do. The poor thing was suffering and had to be put out of its misery. The lynx was unlikely to let him approach her, and with such wounds the animal was unlikely to recover. And now it was hot, flies were buzzing around, and infection would quickly appear. The lynx would die a painful death. It's better to do it now, thought Mr. Gibson as he raised his shotgun. Their eyes met. She stared without blinking, waiting for death as a relief from suffering. Suddenly, the animal jerked and looked in a different direction, as if saying goodbye. The old gamekeeper involuntarily looked in that direction too. In a pile of fallen branches and bushes, he noticed a little muzzle. A lynx cub, nestled in the branches, froze, waiting for its mother's death. He understood everything and was ready to rush to help, but his mother had taught him to hide in the presence of humans. Humans meant death. Mr. Gibson lowered his gun. "All right, Mummy," he said calmly. "It looks like it's too early for you to die. We need to bring up your cub, and so, my friend, we'll figure something out." He walked up very close to the animal, sat down next to it on its haunches, and carefully examined the trap. The lynx, exhausted, hardly moved at all. It had lost a lot of blood and was very weak, only opening its mouth to reveal its sharp teeth. But even this it did weakly, without strength. It was clear that it didn't have enough strength to bite the man. "How did you manage to get caught like this?" the gamekeeper asked the lynx, carefully touching its strong jaws. "It looks like you jumped from above. And what made you come to this logging site?" "Oh, silly thing. Well, never mind. We'll figure something out now." Mr. Gibson went to his motorcycle for tools. Thanks to a small pry bar, he managed to free the animal. The lynx only groaned quietly all this time. At first, it tried to bite, but it only had enough strength to weakly press against the man's hand. "Just sit still, please," the gamekeeper scolded without malice. "I'm doing you good and you still want to eat me?" The lynx cub watched the man's actions from the bushes all this time, and only when Mr. Gibson freed the lynx and it helplessly fell on the grass, the cub, disobeying all its mother's instructions, crawled up to it and, whining pitifully, snuggled up to its belly. "Your baby's hungry," the gamekeeper said deliberately and strictly, "and you're lying there." And then he added more gently, "Well, never mind. We'll get you to my home now, feed everyone, and nurse you back to health. Everything will be fine." He had decided to take the lynx with him when he was tinkering with the trap. But after all, what was the use of freeing it? It wouldn't survive on its own. It needed the lynx's help, and under his supervision it would quickly recover in his barn, and the lynx cub would definitely survive. Otherwise, in the forest it had little chance. It was only about 2 months, no more. When the people in the village saw who the gamekeeper was carrying, they recoiled to the side. A beast's muzzle peered out from under the cover. "Mr. Gibson, is it dead?" shouted the neighbor from the porch of his house. "What do you mean dead?" The old man raised his eyebrows. "It's still alive, just tired out too much. And look at this little addition." And the old man pulled the lynx cub out of his backpack. It only whimpered with fear and closed its eyes. "What are you going to do with it?" asked the neighbor, looking at the lynx, which was barely breathing. "Maybe it's better to put it out of its misery. And by the way, it has such a beautiful skin. To put it out of its misery?" Mr. Gibson got angry. "I'll take care of it. God willing, it will recover." "And the cub? It's so small it will die." The neighbor persisted. "What are you going to feed it with?" It probably still drinks milk from its mother." "You're getting on my nerves," the old man raised his voice. "I'll figure it out without you." Arranging the lynx and the cub on the straw in his barn, the old man said, "Remember, you must survive against all evil tongues. Otherwise, why did I drag you through the forest, straining myself? And you, little one, while I caught you at the logging site, tore my hands, so you must survive." The old man, the lynx, and the cub were all going through a difficult time. There was a moment when Mr. Gibson had already given up hope. The wounds wouldn't heal, and the fever persisted. No medicine helped. The local veterinarian advised shooting the animal, but the gamekeeper cursed him with so much profanity that the vet ran away far from the mad gamekeeper. And the lynx cub worried him. It wouldn't drink cow milk. It refused to suck from a bottle. Then suddenly, Teresa, his daughter, called, and Mr. Gibson told her about his troubles. She quickly turned to the veterinarians in the capital who worked at the zoo. They advised the necessary antibiotics. Mr. Gibson managed to find them with difficulty in the district center. The lynx cub was more difficult. It needed special formulas, and where to get them in their wilderness. That's when the old man decided to buy the simplest baby formula. It turned out that lynx cubs are just like babies, and they really love those formulas. The cub started to get stronger and gain weight right before Mr. Gibson's eyes, and the lynx soon started to recover. The temperature went down and the wound began to heal. The bone was only broken in one leg, and over time she too began to recover. At first, The old man fearlessly went into the barn to see his new pets, but soon realized that the lynx could forget all his kindness and attack him. It was, after all, a wild animal. He started to bring his gun with him, holding medicine in one hand and his weapon in the other. Fortunately, he never had to use it, as the lynx accepted him. Of course, when she regained her strength, the old man no longer gave her injections or bandaged her, but he was still wary. He mixed the medicine in with her food, and the lynx happily gobbled up the chicken and milk, carefully keeping an eye on Mr. Gibson. Meanwhile, the lynx cub played nearby, full and content. Then in the fall, they suddenly disappeared from the barn. Mr. Gibson, as usual, came in the morning with food for his pets, but the barn was empty. He went outside and looked at his faithful dog, Ollie, who was sitting on a chain. "So our guests have left. Thank God. That means they have strength now." Mr. Gibson sadly smiled. Ollie only wagged his tail in response. To be honest, he didn't really like having the tenants in the barn, but since his owner welcomed them, he tolerated them. And he was also afraid of the huge cat that occasionally peeked out of the barn. One winter, Mr. Gibson was returning on skis from the forest when he suddenly felt someone's gaze from above. He looked up and froze. The lynx was sitting right in the tree, and the old man was right under the tree. Well, that's it. She'll attack. The old man only squared his shoulders, but he still reached for his gun. The lynx carefully jumped down next to him and approached the gamekeeper. She even wagged her tail a little. "It's you, my lynx," the old man exclaimed. "What a beauty you've become. And where is your son? He must have grown up by now." Of course, the lynx didn't say anything to him. She just looked into his eyes out and jumped into the bushes. Later on the way back, the old man thought about this outstanding encounter. He couldn't believe the animal had not forgotten him. All winter, he occasionally met the lynx. She didn't come close, but she walked beside him as he toured the forest. Several times she even came into his yard. Ollie then protested, barking very loudly. 2 years passed. Mr. Gibson never quit his job. He kept an eye on the forest animals, and with him, the lynx also made her rounds. People were already laughing at him. He had gotten another dog. He just had to put it on a leash. "Why a dog?" the hunter laughed. "She's not used to a leash and not to human hands either. She only follows me from a distance." One summer, Mr. Gibson's daughter was going to visit him. By that time, she and her husband had a son, so the whole family wanted to visit the grandfather. Mr. Gibson was worried about traveling with the little child, but his daughter laughed. "The airplane will get there in no time, and then it's just a short taxi ride to her parents' house." In short, the old man didn't persuade the young couple, and soon they arrived together. And he was happy about it. He didn't even try to hide it. Little Bobby was so cute and so tiny. He was only 6 months old, but he looked just like Mr. Gibson. Grandpa was overflowing with pride. Bobby was given a separate room, a small one near the kitchen, the warmest. It seems to be summer, but the baby does not need a draft at all. Teresa and her husband James were accommodated in the next bedroom, and Mr. Gibson moved into the living room. In fact, in the small room he usually slept, but he gave up his place for his grandson. They spent time together cheerfully. He and his son-in-law often went fishing and mushroom picking. His daughter stayed home and took care of the baby. In the evenings, they all sat under the old apple tree, had dinner, and talked. The old man was resting his soul. It was a good idea for his daughter to visit him. Every day, they stayed up late chatting, while Teresa listened intently to make sure her son, Bobby, was asleep in the room. "Should we close the window?" Teresa worried. "I opened it for Bobby because it was stuffy. I'm afraid it might get drafty." "Don't worry," James reassured her. "It's stuffy outside and even more so inside. The child won't be able to breathe at all." "Yes, you're right," Teresa agreed. Later, she went to check on her son. Mr. Gibson and his son-in-law were discussing their previous fishing trip, arguing about which tackle was better. Suddenly, they heard Teresa's muffled scream and rushed into the house. Teresa stood on the threshold, pale as chalk. There's a lynx sitting by Bobby's bed. I didn't notice it at first in the dark. Then its eyes started glowing. I looked closer and saw the tufts of fur on its ear in the moonlight. "It's sitting right by the bed and hissing at me," Teresa whispered. I backed away so as not to anger it, but it's still there. And what about Bobby? James also turned pale. He seems to be sleeping, snoring. I heard him, Teresa replied. Everyone, calm down, Mr. Gibson said slowly, stepping into the house holding a thick club in his hands. Dad, be careful, Teresa whispered. It might attack you or Bobby. But Mr. Gibson didn't listen to her. He entered the room and saw a shadow flit by the open window. It's my Lynx, Mr. Gibson guessed, watching the animal disappear. He was limping slightly on his right paw. The Lynx moved like this now, having been saved once by the gamekeeper with its right paw, the one that was more severely wounded, apparently healing somewhat crookedly. The old man watched as the Lynx moved away and mentally scolded himself. Why did he save this animal? He thought. Now it would clearly be circling around his house. Maybe it was jealousy. The gamekeeper didn't know, but he had no other explanation. I should catch the animal, the gamekeeper decided. Catch it and scare it with shots, maybe even hurt it. Mr. Gibson did not see any other way to drive the Lynx away from his house and family. From that evening on, all the windows in the house were closed. Teresa and James only walked with Bobby in the yard, and they stopped going to the forest altogether. The mood was entirely ruined. Mr. Gibson noticed how his daughter was looking at the calendar, counting the days. She already wanted to leave her home as soon as possible. She was afraid for her son, but as it turned out, they were afraid of the wrong thing. One night, Mr. Gibson woke up to an unfamiliar noise. He listened. It seemed quiet. Maybe it was just a dream, he thought. He turned over to the other side, but he couldn't fall asleep. The old man decided to drink some water. He turned on the light in the kitchen, reached for the kettle, and froze. His gaze fell on the stairs that led from the kitchen to the attic. Above was a hatch, and on this staircase Mr. Gibson saw distinct tracks. Large animal tracks, definitely not cat tracks. Since the children arrived, Mr. Gibson's cat had been temporarily relocated to the barn. Teresa was afraid he might jump into the crib and scare the sleeping Bobby. Mr. Gibson took a closer look. It was a lynx. The old man's heart skipped a beat. How did it figure out how to enter the house through the attic? He had missed that. The door from the roof to the attic was open in the summer to ventilate it. There was a hatch in the attic that led to the house. In winter, the old man closed it with a latch to keep it from getting cold, but in summer, he removed the latch because he sometimes climbed up the stairs to the attic to dry mushrooms and berries there. The hatch could easily be lifted from the attic. But that's for a person. Could a wild animal really figure that out? On tiptoe, he walked to the children's room. At the door, he heard a hiss. In the darkness, the greenish lights flashed again. The lynx was sitting by the crib and hissing. "Lynx, what are you doing?" The old man said softly, mentally scolding himself for going without a gun. But on the other hand, how could he shoot with the child sleeping nearby? "Lynx, go away." And then Mr. Gibson heard another sound, as if someone was crawling quickly on the floor. The old man couldn't bear it and turned on the light. Startled, he screamed. Something flashed between the floorboards. "Daddy," he heard his daughter Teresa's frightened voice. What happened? Mr. Gibson turned his completely white face in fear toward his daughter and pointed to a small hole in the floor with a trembling hand. "What?" his daughter exclaimed, then saw the lynx and without hesitation rushed to the crib. "My little son." The noise woke up little Bobby and he cried loudly. Teresa picked him up and ran out of the room. James was already running towards her with a gun. "I'll shoot her now, back off," the man shouted and aimed. The lynx huddled in the corner and only its eyes sparkled. "Don't you dare!" suddenly shouted Mr. Gibson. "Don't shoot. She saved your son." "How so?" James stared at the old man in bewilderment and lowered his gun. "She was protecting him from snakes." "Snakes? Father, where are the snakes here?" "I guess under the floor in the old cellar. I saw her slide in there just now." They approached the place that Mr. Gibson indicated. The lid of the old cellar was securely nailed shut, but there was a small hole next to it for the cat. James ran for a crowbar and soon the lid was lifted. They looked inside and screamed in horror at the same time. Several snakes were wriggling in the cellar, glittering. A bunch of them. Apparently they had bred there. "What do we do with them?" asked James, bewildered. "We'll catch them," Mr. Gibson replied. "I'll get them all quietly." And he then went for a stick and a bag. The lynx followed him. All this time, the animal sat quietly in the corner. Now the lynx reached the stairs, calmly climbed it, pushed the latch with its nose, and quickly got out. The hatch closed. "That's how she comes," Mr. Gibson smiled and wondered. "Since when has she been walking into the house through this hole?" Oh, and he, an old gamekeeper, didn't notice anything. And he didn't notice the snakes either. He almost lost his grandson. James and Mr. Gibson were busy all night. At first, they caught all the snakes. They turned out to be quite poisonous. After dealing with them, the men inspected the cellar and realized how the snakes got into the house. There was a hole in the foundation, and so the vipers crept in here and lived here peacefully. "I wonder how long they've been here," Teresa asked, when all the work had been done by morning. Bobby was sleeping soundly, and the three of them were drinking tea in the kitchen. "Several months, that's for sure," Mr. Gibson replied and shook his head. "And I didn't notice anything." "But your lynx noticed everything," Teresa smiled. "It turns out she's been walking through this hole in the attic for a long time. It's obvious that she's perfectly oriented in the house. She was guarding you at night at first, and then our son." James shook his head in surprise. "What a clever girl. And I had a gun on her." "It's okay, we sorted it out," Mr. Gibson replied. "She thanked me for healing her and saving her son." "You saved her baby?" "And she saved ours," said Teresa. "Animals understand everything. They just can't say it. And how you treat them, that's how they treat you," Mr. Gibson nodded. A week later, Teresa, with her son and husband, left. Mr. Gibson, who had returned from the airport, sat on the bench in front of the house and took a deep breath. Teresa was calling him to come with her again. He misses his family, but to come for a visit and to live are two different things. And then the bushes flashed with brushes. "My lynx came," Mr. Gibson smiled. "No, I'm not going anywhere from here, as long as I have such protectors here."